Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to be in a place, not least with rather better weather than London in mid-November. So it's wonderful to see some sun again. I also was reminded when I came here that Portugal is, of course, known as Britain's oldest ally, and we need all the allies we can get at the moment. So that also seems a very good reason to have come here. I apologize for the fact that I'm going to speak in English. I wouldn't get very far in Portuguese. I also apologize for the fact that what I'm going to say is not quite as cheerful as you might hope. But I presume the organizers, in inviting me, had a good guess of the sort of arguments I would make. I offered many alternative subjects, and this was the subject they chose. So they're responsible for my rather depressing commentary. Obviously, since I accepted this invitation, which was in the summer, a lot more has happened, including notably the results of the American presidential elections, which I think are potentially world transforming. We are very probably now, it seemed likely, but now we are very probably in a year that historians will be writing about a century from now. And it is not, alas, going to be a world transforming event in a good direction. There's not much we can do about it, but we have to recognize that things have become quite seriously unglued in the Western system, in the world, and of course in America and Europe. I'm going to discuss four things. Most of it will be the second, which is on economics, because I'm an economist and it seemed appropriate to focus on this. But it's impossible, obviously, to discuss that outside the broader political context, which both shapes the economics and, probably more important, is shaped by the economics. We are seeing, as has already been mentioned, a rebirth, more than a rebirth by now, a very, very lusty child of populism, of both left and right, and it doesn't seem in the least likely that that's going to get better soon. It is affecting a whole range of countries and political movements. So that's where I'll start, and I'll sort of outline very briefly where I think that has come from. Then I'm going to talk about the economic crises of the world and of Europe in particular within that, how Europe has been affected by and affected the world crises, which are, of course, as has already been mentioned, if you think about unemployment, particularly in Europe, not over. And if you think of disposable incomes across the Western world, definitely not over. Then I'm going to talk about some of the political crises, including, of course, Brexit, one obvious consequence of economic events, in my view. And then I'm going to come to where I think Europe might go, the Europe from which, alas, Britain is leaving, from which, alas, Britain is departing. And I suppose my core argument is that the present terrain on which the European Union, and particularly the Eurozone, stands is fundamentally unstable. It either has too much Europe or it has too little Europe, but where it is now is both too much and too little. And that is, I think, the core of the crisis the European Union now face. It must become either much more or much less. So with those introductory remarks, let me turn, if I may, to very briefly to the subject of the populist framework, the populist mood that is guiding our world today, our Western world, so obviously since the crisis. Populism has emerged just as it did in the 30s, from the left and the right. And by and large, though not universally so, the right is doing better. The right is more successful than the left. The left seems to have done best in the countries that were most hit by the crisis, particularly in southern Europe. And you know about that here. The right has done better in countries affected by economic change, people who are upset about the economic changes affecting their lives, and particularly and deplorably by immigration. The characteristic of right-wing and populism is that it is anti-elite, anti-institutions, I didn't mention that, anti-foreigner, and anti-trade, anti-globalization. It reflects a mix of economic and political forces, particularly prolonged income stagnation, particularly for the middle classes, notably so in the United States, rising inequality, not universal, but it has been the case in many developed countries. That inequality has risen substantially, again, particularly true in the United States. Of course, the wave of financial crises, the great financial crisis of 2007 and 2009, which was followed, as I will discuss, by the crisis within the Eurozone from 2010 to, well, one could debate whether it's over, but it certainly reached its peak in 2012-13. And of course, with economic change, the decline of manufacturing employment, the transformation of our labor markets, and social changes, profound status anxiety of many people in the middle of our income distribution, and I suppose people whom the Americans would refer to and we would refer to as the middle classes. And these anxieties have produced on the right Brexit, Trump, an ascendant Le Pen, the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, and on the left, Podemos, Syriza, and so forth. And in my view, this mood and movement, this vociferous tendency in our politics, the flight from the center, is likely to strengthen, not diminish, at least for some years. We have reached a new crescendo this year, but it might not be over. And I think it has to be said that it threatens the very basic ideas that around which the post-war Western world and subsequently the post-war world were created: international cooperation, international institutions, liberal trade, and those are, of course, the founding principles from which the European Union was built. Now let me turn, if I might, to the economics, as I said I would. So let me start by looking not quite at the global story, but at the story of the developed world as a whole. And I'll put Europe in this context. I hope you can see this chart. It's a very simple one, but I think a very, very revealing one. So the data start in 1979. I could have gone further back. The picture actually wouldn't look so different. And the red line shows actual aggregate GDP. The green line shows the trend growth from 1979 to 2007, continued onwards to 2020. I should say that the numbers are IMF past and IMF recent projections, the October projections. And the blue line, which can be read off the right scale, is the deviation of GDP from trend, from the line given by the green line. So what you will see is, of course, as you can see from the picture, that there was a very strong trend growth up to the financial crisis. And after that there was an immediate dip, quite a significant dip, and then a recovery, but the growth rate of the recovery is much lower than the growth rate before. So we have not only lost a level of output, we have not recovered a growth of output. In fact, the growth of output since then in the developed countries of the world has been roughly half what it was before the crisis. And the result of that is that by 2020, the cumulative loss of GDP in the developed world is forecast by the United States, by the IMF, to be a fifth of GDP, relative to what would have been expected if the pre-2007 growth trends had continued. This is an extraordinarily large loss, quite as big, interestingly, though much slower than occurred during the Great Depression. So it is a very, very massive shock our economies have suffered in aggregate. The response to the financial crisis has been, again, something unique and unprecedented. I'm just going to emphasize here the monetary response. This chart shows the interest rates of the major central banks, the four major Western central banks, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England, going back to 1990. And you can see they've all fallen off a cliff at about the time of the crisis, and they have remained close to zero ever since. The Bank of Japan and the ECB operates negative rates. In fact, today, about 30% of the world economy is run by, if that's the right word, central banks operating negative rates. This is something that has never happened before in world monetary history. And just to put this in context, though I think Trump will probably change this context, the reason I've gone so far back is because I wanted to include Japan going back to the mid-90s, and that's the blue line. And you will see that the Bank of Japan has been operating near zero interest rates for more than 20 years. And the principal monetary worry in Japan remains today, as it has been throughout that period, deflation, not excessively high inflation. One other point should be made about this chart, which is, I think, quite interesting, is the ECB missed what was going on more completely than any other of the important central banks. And that is one of the reasons, but by no means the most important reasons, the Eurozone crisis has been so problematic, which is that in 2011, it decided everything was over, everything was fine, and so it decided to raise rates. And you can see the brief, because things were going back to normal, rates were raised above, I think they reached 1.5%, if I remember correctly. I might have got that wrong. And then they realized very, very soon this was a disaster. And of course, interest rates collapsed back down again and are now negative. And in addition to that, the ECB is engaged, as the US and UK were in the past and the Bank of Japan is today, in a massive quantitative easing program, monetary expansion as well. Now, that's the monetary context and the growth context. This is designed, I'm now going to turn and look more closely at how the Eurozone has performed, compared in particular with the US, and why the ways in which the economic crisis has been particularly severe for the Eurozone. This has been one of my favorite charts. Basically, it shows real demand and real GDP in the Eurozone and the US. The red line is US real GDP. The green line is US real demand, real domestic demand. The blue line is Eurozone real GDP, and the yellow line is Eurozone real demand. And there are essentially 3 points I want you to take from this chart. First, which everybody knows, is that after a deep recovery, a deep recession, which was actually shallower in the US than in the Eurozone, the US has managed a recovery at about 2% growth a year. It is the weakest recovery on record in the US. This is a very poor recovery, but it is a recovery with real domestic demand rising roughly in line with GDP. So it's not predominantly, it's basically been, except in the very beginning when the deficit diminished, it's been domestic demand led. The Eurozone, on the other hand, has had two crises. There was a first recovery and then a coincident with this monetary policy mistake and the emergence of the crisis in Greece and the subsequent difficulties elsewhere, including here, the Eurozone had a second crisis, which brought it to a second recession, which you can see very, very clearly, and that was led, as you can see from the yellow line, with a massive decline in real domestic demand, a really massive domestic demand shock, completely mad, which was allowed to happen, reached its trough in early 2013. Since then, real demand and real GDP have risen roughly in parallel. The external rebalancing occurred mostly during that massive period of declining real demand. But it is worth noting that in the second quarter of 2016, real domestic demand, I don't have the third quarter yet, the real domestic demand in the Eurozone was still significantly below where it was in the first quarter of 2008. There has been not stagnation, there has not yet been recovery to the starting point in real domestic demand. This picture underlines that because it shows what's happened to unemployment in the Eurozone and the US. And you can see that after a big surge in the US, it was a much bigger surge from a lower level, the US unemployment has fallen back towards 5%, slightly below it, while in the case of the Eurozone, unemployment again rose twice with the two recessions and is now on a very, very slow decline. It seems to have bottomed out almost completely and is now running at about 10%. Nobody knows what full employment is in the Eurozone, but it's certainly lower than this. It seems very little difficult to believe that it isn't, and the inflation numbers seem to support that. And this underlies precisely this point. Here I compare consumer price inflation core, so that strips out the variable factors, of which energy and food are the most important. And you can see that because of the relatively aggressive US policies, monetary and fiscal, US inflation at the core is back to its target, actually slightly over 2%. The Eurozone has not hit on core its inflation targets since the crisis began. Not once. It has been below 2%. Which is supposed to be close to, but below 2%. And it has, the last time it got there was there. So it is perfectly clear that judged in terms of its success in hitting its inflation goals, the ECB has consistently failed. This is not because it hasn't recently been trying, but because it has been unable to generate, as I've already showed you, the real demand that is needed. Now, one of the consequences of this crisis and a central feature of this crisis is a massive divergence in economic performance and economic condition across Europe in a very, very short period of time. So to take the obvious, right at the left-hand side, German GDP per head has risen since between 2007 and this year, this is a forecast, by more than 10%. Sweden's has risen by 6%, the UK by about 3%. At the other end, Greek GDP per head has fallen by 27%, Italy's has fallen by 11%, Spain by 8%, and Portugal also by 7.6%. So over a relatively short period of time, relative GDP per head between Germany on the one hand and crisis-hit countries have diverged by 20% of starting GDP in opposing directions, one up, one down. So the crisis has generated a massive divergence. And of course, On the whole, the countries that have done very well, or the countries have been least adversely affected, have been relatively rich ones. And the result is a number of poorer countries, which I show here, have suffered consistent declines in relative GDP per head since the crisis, and some from even earlier than that. What I've got here is just a number of countries: France, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And this shows their GDP per head relative to Germany at purchasing power parity, starting in 2000, 2007, and then 2016. So in the case of France, there was a more or less level pegging till 2007, then a big decline. Greece had a rise and then an immense fall. That's the blue line. Ireland, a rise and then a small fall. Italy and Portugal have both had continuous falls, but particularly large declines since the crisis. Spain had a small rise and then a fall. So they haven't all had consistent falls relative to Germany. Italy and Portugal fall into those cases, but they've all suffered enormous declines in real GDP per head relative to Germany since the crisis. The crisis has generated massive divergence. And another way in which the crisis has generated massive divergence is its impact on public debt. Germany's net public debt has remained more or less constant at well below 60%. Portugal, Italy, France, Spain, and Ireland have experienced immense rises in public debt over a really very, very small period between 2007 and 2016. These are IMF data, not Eurostat data, but I presume they're essentially the same. Though the Portuguese increase is to an incredibly high level, I think two of the most interesting cases are Spain and Ireland, because they went into the crisis with almost no net debt as well, at all. And as I've argued many times, private sector financial crises, they both suffered huge private sector financial crises, always generate, when they happen, a follow-through, which is huge fiscal deficits and fiscal debt rises, and that's what's happened to Spain and Portugal. Spain and Ireland in particular, though to some degree in other cases, this wasn't a fiscal crisis initially, but it became one. That is a completely natural development. And the final area of divergence that I want to bring out is what's happened to unemployment. These are the unemployment rates of France, Germany, Italy, the Eurozone as a whole, which is this line, which is a bit faint, I'm afraid. The UK, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. Spain and Greece experienced simply massive rises in unemployment, which are now very slowly falling. Portugal didn't have as big a rise, which was rather remarkable, and it's now been on a long decline, as you know. But all these countries, including France, have immensely much higher unemployment than Germany, which is down here. So again, a massive divergence in unemployment performance, and that rise in unemployment I showed you earlier in the Eurozone is all driven by the hits that crisis-hit countries, and particularly, but also France, have suffered during this crisis. Some of the other small countries, Finland too, have suffered. So there's been massive divergence also in employment performance. This crisis, in the way it's played out, is about as dramatic a demonstration of the failure of the Eurozone to secure convergence among its members, and particularly among its poorer members, towards the level of income of the richer ones, and particularly the biggest and most powerful economy. On the contrary, it has turned out, as I rather feared it would, to be a massive divergence machine, a machine generating massive economic, fiscal divergence. Now, I can't go through in this brief talk my explanation for what's been going on, but I will summarize it very briefly in this chart, which shows Eurozone external imbalances as they have evolved since 2000 and where we are today. And through this, I can summarize very briefly I suspect Heiner Flassbeck will be saying more about this later, the sort of story I would tell about how we got where we were. So back in 2000, the Eurozone as a whole had an aggregate current account balance of close to zero. That's the blue line. And Germany actually had a small deficit. People probably forget that. France had a small surplus. But everybody was close to balance. By 2008, enormous imbalances had emerged, which basically had the characteristic of an enormous surplus emerging in Germany and in other creditors, of which the most important by far is the Netherlands. And that was offset by enormous deficits in crisis-hit countries. And this is already mentioned. Spain was immensely important because it was a large deficit countries, but also Portugal and Greece. These were countries running current account deficits of 10% of GDP or so. What was going on here? Well, in essence, what was going on here, and this is to summarize it, is that aggregate demand in Germany was very, very weak. Competitiveness was being improved in Germany year by year because of very, very low wage increases relative to productivity increases. Germany was becoming increasingly competitive. The labour market reforms helped that along. The ECB, therefore, found itself confronting an economy in which the strongest economy had very, very weak demand. So it actually pursued, just as in the US, a pretty aggressive monetary policy. And this was at a time of very rapid credit growth in economies that were prepared to tolerate that. So credit duly exploded in quite a wide number of countries that, one should remember this, had never had such low nominal and real interest rates before. Inflation started rising in these countries. They started losing competitiveness. But because inflation was rising, real interest rates were really low in the capital importing countries. And financial flows, predominantly from the north of Europe, flowed into the south, also from other parts of the world, in an enormous way, generating these enormous cumulative deficits of the crisis-hit countries. The crisis hit, the lenders panicked, private flows stopped. There was a sudden stop within Europe. The countries that had been large borrowers went into shock. The borrowing stopped. The spending of the private sector obviously had to stop. Banks got into difficulty and government deficits exploded. I've already told you that. There was some modest financing of these deficits, largely through the European Central Bank, through its automatic operations of its monetary system, but that which just cushioned this a little. But in an incredibly short time, all the deficits disappeared as spending in the crisis-hit countries contracted. And you can see the deficits disappear, but the surplus didn't. There was no adjustment in the core. So what has ended up happening is the Eurozone as a whole became the chronic zone of chronically deficient demand I've already described for you in the other chart. And every country in the Eurozone this year, every country, according to the IMF, except France, will be in surplus. Every single country. And the cumulative surplus has shifted by roughly 4.5%, I think it is 4.5% of Eurozone GDP, which, by the way, is a massive negative shock for the rest of the world economy. So that, very briefly, is where we are, and this is where we're stuck. And the growth pattern going forward is now assumes to be stable in this situation, with everybody running surpluses. By 2020, according to the IMF, nobody in the Eurozone will run a deficit. And therefore, the Eurozone as a whole depends massively on external demand for sustaining levels of activity. Now, part of the problem in what's gone wrong here is, as I've already indicated, internal adjustment hasn't happened. So let's think about how internal adjustment might happen to a shock of this kind. The standard principle in a gold standard type system, which is essentially what the Eurozone is, it's a monetary union, but doesn't have any fiscal union, so the countries are essentially separate. In a gold standard type system, without transfers, the only way adjustment occurs is through changes in relative prices. And what should happen is that surplus countries with strong willingness to lend and ability to lend, or in this case, in the old system that David Hume described, monetary flows would have inflation, and the deficit countries would have some deflation, and the combination of inflation in the surplus countries and deflation in the deficit countries would bring over time adjustment in the relative prices and get you back into something closer to equilibrium. The problem is, while the deficit countries indeed, some of them have had very large deflation, Ireland and Greece, you can see, have had periods of quite rapid falling prices. That's not true of everybody. The deflation has been very difficult to achieve, as everybody thought it would in a modern economy. The surplus countries don't have any inflation. So Germany's inflation, we can't see very clearly, but it's basically here. It's been consistently close to 1%. So the only way to improve competitiveness is to have actual deflation, and actual deflation makes real indebtedness worse, and it makes the debt problem worse. So the adjustment process has been blocked, and that makes this a long and very, very painful process of recovery, and there's nothing in the system to change this. Finally, let me just say one thing about Brexit. Britain has an immense number of disadvantages which I can't go into, but we do have one advantage, which is we still have a currency, and we have had an enormous real exchange rate depreciation, which you can see at the end, which has brought the currency in real terms to as low as it's been at any time since 1970, and that should help our adjustment to the Brexit shock, which just confirms the view I've always held, that having your own currency, and I know you disagree here in Portugal, having your own currency is a catastrophic disadvantage 95% of the time, but 5% of the time it's vital. Now, let me summarize what I have to say, then say very briefly what I think about the politics and end. So, the Eurozone has been delivering deflation and divergence, not prosperity and convergence. That's been true now for about a decade, and it seems to me this is a very critical crisis for the Eurozone. It's because of structural weaknesses in many economies. I always felt that linking every country to Germany, one of the world's most competitive countries, always, and even more so now, is very risky. It has structurally weak aggregate demand in the core. It has blocked adjustment mechanisms, and there are insufficient mechanisms for sustained financing of countries if you can't adjust. And there is a real risk that some economies will simply fail in the long term. They will, as I think of them, as sort of wither away. Young people will leave, they will die. Meanwhile, the UK, as I've suggested, confronts a very painful adjustment. On the political crises facing Europe are very easy to describe, and I'll just mention them very quickly. The first and most important is to get back to prosperity, and the question is how this can be done. And right at the moment, I have to say, I remain very pessimistic about a really strong recovery, not only in the Eurozone as a whole, but in all its weaker members, because that's what's needed. There needs to be a recovery in the weaker members. At the current rate of growth, I won't talk about Portugal, at the current rate of growth, Italy won't get back to pre-crisis levels of GDP for about another 8 or 9 years. It will therefore have lost 15 years. I don't believe that's going to be tenable. I think that's just not going to be tenable. In addition to this, the EU confronts massive international relations challenges now with the US, which is in a process of revolution, with Russia, and of course with the Middle East. It confronts a major migration challenge. I haven't mentioned terrorism, but obviously it could be mentioned, and it confronts the Brexit challenge. Can the EU cope with these simultaneous economic, international relations, and internal challenges? It's going to be immensely difficult. Too little Europe and too much. The EU's life will not be made easier by Brexit. I don't think that's going to be a transformative event for the better. Some people hope. I don't know what's happened here. I've never seen this happen before. Something is misreading my lines. But anyway, let me just tell you what the line would say. The problem in the Eurozone is how to handle the core problem, I think, is how to handle a monetary union with economies that are so dissimilar economically, politically, and culturally. And my view now is that that could have worked, that the Eurozone structure could have worked probably pretty well if they had been more similar, but since they're not, it's going to have to be transformed. And it can only be transformed in one of two ways. Either it becomes a much more integrated political system with all the attributes of a genuinely integrated political system like the US, or there has to be genuine adjustment in the core. Otherwise, the system is dysfunctional. So that seems to me where the Eurozone is. It's an incredibly difficult challenge. Of course, the UK has moved from being semi-detached to being fully detached. We're going to discuss Brexit later, but I think we're going to end up with a pretty hard Brexit because the British demand will be for control over immigration, and that I think will mean we'll be outside the single market completely, and maybe we can have a free trade area in goods, but that's the best that can be plausibly expected. It's going to be a very big shock for the UK. As I said, the EU's life will not be made easier by Brexit. And for the EU, when I look at the EU and all the crises it faces, we assume, because we always want to assume, that things will continue as they were, that the past is normal, that life will continue as we love it and want it. If the Trump vote shows us anything, it shows us that that isn't always the case. The challenges we confront are so big that the survival, even of the EU, cannot be assumed. Just look this week at the inability of Germany to get France, don't forget about Britain, to a meeting to discuss the implications of Trump's election. The EU is no longer a coherent entity. That's how I see it. Thank you for listening. So, do I take questions?
Yes.
Can I sit down? Or?
Maybe it's easier. Well. Okay. So, as you know, or desculpem, ainda estava no ritmo inglês. Desculpem, o nosso tempo é muito limitado, mas Martin Wolf fez muito questão em em ter algum debate e, portanto, pediria às pessoas que interviessem que fizessem de uma forma muito rápida, sem muitas considerações prévias, indo diretamente às questões que querem colocar. Por favor, Ricardo Paes Mamed, terceira fila. Não, doutora Natália, terceira fila.
Maybe it's better if I speak in English, it's faster. Thank you very much for your usual clarity. You have emphasized the problem of price competitiveness of the Southern European countries. Only in the very end of your presentation, you mentioned structural weaknesses, which I would understand as non-price competitiveness problems, which I think are extremely important to explain external deficits of these countries. And this connected with the very steep appreciation of the euro after 2002 seems to me a very big part of the external imbalances in the Eurozone. Can you elaborate on this since you haven't mentioned it?
I agree with that. That's what I meant by dissimilarity. Because Germany is one of the most competitive exporters and runs an enormous current account surplus, there's also the Netherlands. The tendency of the currency bloc of which they're part will be towards being quite strong because they have a huge surplus. And that's a natural tendency. That won't always be the case. Might be periods when there will be such large floods of capital out of the Eurozone, and particularly from these surplus countries outside it, that the euro will become weak. And there are other reasons people might be frightened about the survival of the Eurozone. That would also make the currency weak. But the dominant tendency, as long as it's a credible currency, is for the currency to be very strong, as the old D-mark was. And this hasn't fundamentally altered with the addition of these other countries. So the external real exchange rate is strong. Because of the mechanism that I discussed, is point 2. That was point 1. Point 2, because of the mechanism I discussed, the real exchange rates, and I couldn't put all that in. These figures are in my book, my recent book, which discusses all this much length. Real exchange rates relative or competitiveness vis-a-vis Germany of pretty well every other economy declined in the period leading up to 2007. So the problem with the external current exchange rate, real exchange rate tending to be very highly valued, was reinforced by what was going on inside. And then you come to what you called the structural problems. And here I would just make 2 comments which I think are relevant to this. First, by and large, and I can't go through all the countries involved, the exports of most countries, the price elasticities of demand of the exports of most countries in the Eurozone are higher than those of German exports. That is to say, the loss of price competitiveness is more important for their ability to export because they can't increase prices because they're not producing goods which are essentially unique and have very pronounced quality advantages. 2, these are a subset of my third. 2, most of the other countries have fundamentally and have long had less internationally competitive, less special firms with special knowledge which are unique to those countries and which are relatively protected against global competition, in which Germany is outstanding. And finally, and this is perhaps the most important point, which I don't think I've made often enough, but I do think is very important, is that the global economic changes of the last 15, 20 years, have tended to benefit Germany. By this I mean above all the opening of Eastern Europe and the opening of, above all, of Asia, and China above all, has tended to provide an increased market for German exports of capital goods and very high quality consumer goods, and provided much more competition for countries producing textiles, clothing, other relatively similar manufacturing. So other things being equal, the countries in the latter camp needed huge depreciations in real terms to reflect their declining international competitiveness, and Germany needed a real appreciation. What the Eurozone delivered in its early years was the inverse of that. So my analysis will be a combination of structural forces which have generated increased divergence, which was masked by the financial conditions before 2007 and has become more obvious since then.
Vítor Corrado, Simões, Isaac. You addressed mainly the issues of the Western world. Somewhat implicitly, the Eastern world was there, although you have never referred to it. In the last answer, you pointed out that. Therefore, my question is the following. In an increasingly Easternized world, or Asian world, how do you think that less European integration will provide good results? Could you elaborate on this, please?
I think the best result would be much more European integration. So the optimal will be more European integration. The question, though, is whether so we are clearly in a second or third or fourth best world. We're making bad choices. And I was very clear that I would like, it seems to me the logic of the situation that the Europeans have chosen for themselves. I was always quite clear about this. It seems to me absolutely clear when the decision was made to create the Eurozone that it would require a substantially higher degree of political, economic, and institutional integration than the Eurozone possessed at the beginning. And many answered that the crisis would solve this problem. And I think the crisis has solved this problem to a small degree, but not sufficiently. It's insufficient. The question then comes, is the least bad world a continuation of the present or disintegration? I'm not arguing for disintegration. In my book, I have argued very clearly that the costs of disintegration are so massive that it is completely reasonable that people would want to avoid them. While I wouldn't consider the rise of China and the East Asia as a decisive factor in that regard, it's at least a factor. So the costs of disintegration are massive, but I wasn't making a normative statement. I was making a positive statement. The risk, it seems to me, is that in the current situation of extreme divergence and stagnation, political forces will get out of control. Somewhere, at some point, somebody will be elected in an important country who will be determined to break these constraints on policy freedom, and then the system smashes. So it is not a normative statement, it is an empirical statement. I hope I am wrong, but I'm not at all sure I am wrong anymore. I have wobbled on this, but I remain at the view that the current political economy of the Eurozone is not stable. I don't see it lasting indefinitely. I may be wrong. I hope it doesn't last as it is indefinitely, because it is creating too much unhappiness. The divergences are too extreme. The disappointments are too great. And let me make one final point. I'm sure you are all aware of this much better than I am, but the promise of Europe from the beginning of the 50s onwards was the promise of peace and prosperity. That was the promise. And to an extraordinary degree, it was achieved. I'm not going to go into the question of whether we can be confident in the peace. I don't think we can. But it's pretty clear the last 10 years have not brought prosperity. And that has changed the vision of Europe, the way people see it. And I think that's incredibly dangerous for the future of this political project. Will we do better in dealing with China if we're together? Yes, but only if we're together, or not, we won't be part of it. If you're together in a coherent and logical and effective way. Otherwise, it won't work.
Thank you very much for your conference, your speech. It's very heartening. I don't think pessimism at this stage is a bad thing. On the contrary, what's bad is keeping illusions and trying solutions that are false steps. You said more integration, either political integration or loosening, breaking to a certain extent. This will take time. Meanwhile, we are in crisis, and the crisis is deepening. So the question is, given the emerging consensus that monetary policy alone cannot solve the problem, fiscal policy is emerging as a sort of source of stimulation that is absolutely required for investment, for instance, given the fact that the monetary union, our rules are such that for several of our countries, especially Portugal, if you are going to respect monetary union rules, the government has to cut investment. There is no other solution. And this, of course, launches a spiral. So the question is, given the emerging consensus that fiscal policy stimulations are absolutely essential, and international bodies are going along that with variations, with the present, let's say, political outlook of the Europe and the working of the Council and working of the Commission, how do you envisage the possibility of a role for fiscal policy as a stimulator? How useful or how powerful this could be given the fact that even fiscal stimulation, unless it takes a huge size, perhaps it's not very helpful.
I can probably answer this fairly quickly. My reading of the current situation in Europe is that the possibilities of agreeing a huge fiscal stimulus, by huge, I mean at the very least 3% of GDP, something in that neighborhood, and that's the least, over many years, are zero. I may be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but I believe that is the case. I think you have other participants who might be more expert on this, but I think the chances that this will be agreed are close to zero. I believe that a number of member states are powerful enough to do this on their own, but the difficulty would come, it seems to me, that as I understand what the ECB is doing, if a member state with very large debts were to pursue a large fiscal expansion which completely and utterly ignored the rules collectively agreed, the ECB would no longer be able to continue with its purchase program. And if that is the case, though it would clearly create a crisis, then it seems to me the fiscal program could not be continued. I don't think it's very difficult to envisage what countries I'm referring to. So individual nations that would need it don't seem to me in a position to do this. It requires cooperation with the ECB because their debt levels are so high and they're not genuinely sovereign. That's the nature of the Eurozone. So as things stand at the moment, I can't see a way out on fiscal policy. The only thing that would change this is if the perception grew in places that matter, particularly Berlin, obviously, that it was either that or a breakup. This is certainly not the perception now, and therefore it seems to me nothing will happen. I think there is a strong perception in very important places in Europe that actually things are fine, that to the extent they're not fine, it's all the fault of the countries that haven't been performing properly. And in any case, doing anything to make it better will merely stop the necessary structural reforms. And therefore, for these reasons, nothing's going to happen.
Rui Gonçalves, a very quick question. Martin, do you see a split in the Northern EU and the Southern EU as a third best solution for the situation we are in? Thank you.
A number of people have made this suggestion from the very beginning of the crisis. One of them was my friend Martin Taylor, who was formerly chief executive of Barclays Bank. If I were going to be brutally honest, I would say that it would have been very sensible to have started that way, or to have grown the Eurozone more slowly. I think a lot of people in the South, I don't know Portugal well, so I can't comment on what happened here, but I did discuss joining the Euro with people in Spain and Italy, in the late 90s, and I was surprised by what seemed to me their insouciance about some of the risks which were consuming us in Britain when we were thinking about whether to join. So I think it would have been better if they had not joined then, or if they had thought more carefully of what it would mean to join, which they didn't. The problem, however, is going from here to there, which is, even if you wanted to do it, and it obviously will be a tremendous defeat for the European project, which brings us back to the desirable features of the European project, which I fully believe in and fully share. I mean, I was against the euro not because I was anti-European, but because I was pro-European. Let me be very clear. I've been against it for 25 years. I thought it would break Europe up. I wrote this in the early 90s. So, but the problem is, now you have it. Breaking up involves two massive risks. First, it's a shatteringly difficult, complex, and disruptive process. Breaking up a currency union involves clearly the reintroduction of exchange controls for some extended period, the redenomination of contracts into another currency, and the complexities that involves legally because of where the contracts have all been agreed, a period when credit, international credit will dry up. So it will be a really big mess. And it will certainly include, in the short term, very severe depressions. Or certainly severe recession. So the breaking up is a nightmare. That is very good reason for staying together. And secondly, it would shatter, I think, the EU. So I would return to what I said earlier. While I fear this result, I hope it won't happen, and that people find a way of making the euro as it is work. But to do so, it has to have a more symmetrical adjustment mechanism and or more effective fiscal and other mechanisms to ensure prosperity is reasonably widely shared. A Eurozone that doesn't generate reasonably widely shared prosperity seems to me a Eurozone built on sand.